So good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this side event entitled Mapping the Risk of Future Displacement in the Context of Climate Change. This is a side event that is co-organized by IDMC and the United Nations University Institute for Environment and Human Security with the support of IOM. I'd like to welcome all of you participants for joining us here this morning, and of course our speakers, who I will be introducing to you all briefly, very shortly. My name is Alexandra Bilak. I'm the director of IDMC, which is the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center. We are a global center based in Geneva, monitoring internal displacement caused by both conflict and sudden and slow onset disasters across the world. Our role is to provide data and analysis on this topic that is a topic of global scale, and to provide expertise and support to governments and policymakers working to prevent, to respond to, and to resolve this issue. Just a few words about why we've organized this side event this morning. At IDMC, ever since we started collecting data on disaster displacement back in 2008, we have reported a very large number of displacements due to weather-related hazards, 359 million such displacements, mainly caused by floods and storms, which represents an average of 22.4 million displacements every year. What our analysis and our data shows is that disaster displacement is very much a global issue. Last year we reported it happening from China to even Azerbaijan here. What we also know is, as the IPCC tells us with high confidence, is that climate change is increasing the frequency and the intensity of weather-related hazards that are triggering displacement. But the key questions that we have been asking ourselves now are, can we predict future disaster displacement? Can we already identify today who is likely to be at risk tomorrow? Can we identify where the people most at risk are located in the world? And importantly, how can this risk analysis help decision makers to be better prepared so that they can respond to this issue in the future? So in order to answer these questions, IDMC has engaged in disaster displacement risk analysis since 2015 in order to support policymakers and operational actors with the right kind of information on the displacement risks that countries face and the potential number of people who might be affected by this issue. So we developed our first global disaster displacement risk model back in 2017, and since then we've collaborated with a wide range of partners, including the United Nations University and the Chima Foundation, who are joining the panel today, to improve our model. So the most recent iteration of this model estimates the risk of displacement by weather-related hazards that include floods, drought, cyclonic winds, and coastal flooding at the country level. And it does so according to both an optimistic and a pessimistic climate change scenario. We will go into the details of the model in a few minutes, but our first findings indicate, as you can probably imagine, that in both scenarios the risk of displacement is likely to continue to rise, but with a number of people at risk of displacement much higher in the case of a pessimistic scenario. So I'm joined today by a great panel to discuss the opportunities but also the challenges involved in engaging in risk modeling approaches, and to hear from them about not just the ongoing efforts that we've done as a collective to improve our understanding of disaster displacement risk, but also what some of these opportunities can be from the global to the country level. So before opening the panel discussion, let me introduce them to you all. We're here joined by our first speaker, Mr. Robert Oakes, who is a senior researcher at the United Nations University's Environment and Human Security unit. His research focuses on understanding in which circumstances human mobility should be considered a form of adaptation or a form of loss and damage. And UNU EHS, as I mentioned, is one of the IDMC key partners for the Global Disaster Displacement Risk Model. So welcome, Robert. We are then joined by Dr. Roberto Rudari, next to him, who's Research and Program Director at the CIMA Foundation. Roberto has more than 15 years of experience in risk assessment and civil protection applications, especially in the context of flood and drought events. The CIMA Foundation is also a key partner, as I said, for the Global Disaster Displacement Risk Model. And then we are joined by Suzanne Milder, who is the Global Thematic Specialist on Climate Action in the Policy and Program Support Division at IOM. So welcome, Suzanne. Finally, we'll also have the pleasure towards the end of the side event of welcoming Robert Piper for some final reflections. As some of you may know, Robert is the UN Secretary General's Special Advisor on Solutions to Internal Displacement. He took up this position in June 2022 to advance the implementation of the UNSG's agenda on internal displacement solutions. So welcome to you all. So I'm going to start with a question to Robert, to perhaps explain to our audience how IDMC and UNU EHS have worked together to improve this model. But could you share with us what are the next... sorry, I seem to have... that's the second question. I'd like you to explain a little bit how we've worked together and perhaps explain briefly what some of the initial results of the global displacement risk model are, and explain also why UNU EHS was eager to join this initiative with IDMC and our other partners. So over to you.
Thank you, Alexandra, and thank you, IM, for putting on the pavilion and the event. I think just in terms of our role within the project, we've been talking with IDMC, working with IDMC, as other organisations have been for a while. But over the last year, our work together has been in more detail. And what we wanted to do was give our understanding about kind of the more complex nuance within human mobility, even from within the field of migration, actually into displacement. So when we think about displacement risk, I'm sure we understand risk as a combination of, on the one hand, we have the hazard, then we have the populations exposed to that hazard, but then, of course, we have the vulnerability of those populations. But what has happened in reality, due to models and the way that models are produced and the data which is used to build effective models, vulnerability tends to be the poor relation in these models. When vulnerability is included, it tends to be quite a narrow framing of vulnerability, and it tends to be linked to socioeconomic indicators, which of course makes sense and of course is really important, but it isn't the full picture. So what we've been trying to do over the last year, and as Alexandra mentioned, I'll mention what we plan to do a little bit more in the future, is to bring in a bit more of this ground truthing, kind of based on theory about why people move. So, for example, if we think about what some people might know as the foresight model or the black model, whereby environmental risk interacts with environmental, cultural, social, demographic. You can keep naming these factors, right? And people experience what's going on in their local environment. They make a decision of what's happening in my environment relative to what's happening, what might be my alternative, right? But to get data for these concepts is rather problematic, and that's what we've been trying to do over the last year, to try and break this down, to really kind of understand what might be driving this. So what we've been trying to do in terms of the drought model, for example, is just to get in some data to represent different elements of this kind of complexity. I won't go into detail on this, but we have, at the moment, just one indicator for each of these kind of 5 elements of political, demographic, social, economic, and environmental. The plan is to expand upon and build upon this if and when we feel comfortable with our with our data. Just in terms of what the model has done at the moment, so as Alexandra mentioned, we've looked at floods, storms, droughts until now, and we have the elements of the hazards, the exposure, vulnerability, and this is all combined into Climada, which is a probabilistic tool which is able to kind of compute all of these ideas. And in the end, what we have is a risk of displacement, and as Alexandra mentioned, an average annual displacement, but also a probable maximum displacement. And we have this by country, and in some countries we have by lower levels, but admin 1. So just in terms of results, very briefly, so I had some slides, but we can't show them, but in terms of, say, for Somalia, in terms of drought by 2050, so if we're thinking about an optimistic climate scenario, RCP 2.6, it could be that 0.7 million people are internally displaced in 2050. In case there's a severe drought, which is like a 50-year event, 50-year storm. But this goes up to 1.4 million if there is an extreme drought, which is a 100-year type drought. And of course, 100-year droughts within climate change, that becomes more and more common. Then briefly, in terms of the kind of pessimistic scenario in RCP 8.5, which we hope we're not going to get to, depending on how we go these weeks, 2.3 million people are projected to be displaced. And in case of extreme drought, this goes up to 2.9 million. Just briefly then about next steps. So we want to continue to refine all the elements of this in terms of hazard, exposure, vulnerability. So our work in particular is to do with the vulnerability and trying to get a broader, deeper, more robust understanding of how vulnerability might interact with actually moving, because I think what's important to realize is that within displacement there's often a degree of agency. So people are, yes, they're forced to move, but there's some sort of control about how and when they move in some situations. And we also need to look at the actual ability to move. So looking at some of these socioeconomic indicators as well. Then what's very important and has been a focus in IDMC for a while is looking at this idea of temporality, so protracted displacement. So at the moment, we know that people are living in a state of prolonged displacement, but the data for tracking these is, I think IDMC is leading on this, but it's difficult to know how long people are actually displaced for. What we're interested in the end is what are the impacts of these. So if people are displaced for a longer time, we think that the losses and damages which are suffered are worse. So if we can get a better understanding of the factors which might drive these longer periods of displacement in terms of the hazards, the vulnerable populations, then eventually we can have better evidence for policy and programming for this. I think we're about time now. Okay, I'll wrap up then.
Thanks very much, Robert. Some really key concepts here that I'm sure Roberto is going to be speaking to as well in his intervention. But I think this question of vulnerability indeed is key, because it is what determines ultimately the initial scale of displacement, but also then the ability of people to recover and in which time period. So as you said, this is key for us to better understand the risk of protractedness of disaster displacement in these contexts. You've also mentioned the hazards themselves, that we know that they are likely to increase in intensity and frequency. And some of the results that you've mentioned for Somalia, we can already see that these types of droughts are becoming more and more frequent, much more so than over a 50 or 100-year period. So again, we need to also probably, would you agree, at least to say that this is probably already a significant underestimate what this model is showing. And then when it comes to the exposure layer, I think it would be great for Roberto to say a few words about what we already understand about exposure and vulnerability. So over to you, Roberto, to tell us more about some of these concepts and to explain to us how the CIMA Foundation has contributed to better unpacking exposure and vulnerability. How do we assess those two concepts, and what types of data are needed to make this sort of analysis more and more precise for the future?
Well, thank you for the hard question to be answered, and thank you also for Robert for, let's say, setting the scene, which will spare me, a lot of, let's say, introductory remarks, let's say that is. Well, you understood that, this type of model is a probabilistic one, and that already forces us, to go into the direction of quantification. So there are, many modeling techniques, especially for displacement, they could be, qualitative in nature. But if you want to go probabilistic, you're forced, to quantify, okay? And that poses a lot of challenges. And normally, this is done for economic, values. For, let's say, cat modeling, the usual thing. It's so much easier than facing, the modeling of displacement because of the human factor, and specifically to capture the vulnerability, let's say, connected to that, it's very complex. Luckily, we had, let's say, to resolve the issues more on the fast onset bit, which is a little bit less challenging than the slow onset that Robert was, explaining before. And how did we reason about that? We wanted to advance a little bit, from, the previous models that IDMC already, let's say, packaged in 2017. And we wanted to understand a little bit, the root causes of, possible displacement. And then we unpacked this, basically into three, factors to start with. The first one is very easy, when you're forced to move when you lose your house. If you don't have like a house to stay, you're more probably, moving somewhere. Okay, sorry. And so, damages to houses, it's really like, the housing is one of the key points. Then you might want to move because you're losing your means of livelihoods in general. So a bit more indirect, but still, present as a thing. Or, even more indirect, you're losing, access to critical functions. Okay, you lose access to water, you lose access to education for long periods. This is, even more, let's say, related, to long-term, type of reasonings of people. So we tried, to model, those factors, and I would say that, in doing this, with applying, physical vulnerability curves, for quantifications, we discovered that, it was, a very good move, for two reasons. Okay, so the first one is that, we were able, to factor in already some socioeconomic factor. Let's say, ideally, just by, for example, including, building typologies. The different, building typologies are already telling you, who's living in the house, what type of housing you're living in is telling you something about your status. No, so having a differentiation, about, house and building typologies already giving you, this angle, as it is, your means of livelihood. Okay, this is already, framing you, in a certain, let's say, cluster of the population. And, the vulnerability for accessing, let's say, the final, let's say, the critical facilities is even, more describing the factors of your vulnerability. So, just by, unpacking, I would say, these vulnerability factors, we were factoring not only the physical part, which is fundamental because of the quantification nature of the analysis, but also, some socioeconomic factors. The second part is that, when we have the results, we can disaggregate them by the factors. Okay, so we can know, or we can guess, we can model. How many people are moving because of the loss of housing? How many are moving because they are losing their job or their means of sustainability? Okay, all with that. And this is giving us, like, more insight, also into the results, because we can link that, to mitigation actions. If we know the root cause, the main root cause, for mobility, then we can do something about it, to mitigate that. So that is very important. There are, however, really big challenges in try to describe this, especially when you do a global exercise as we did, because, of course, it's not just, enough, to know where people are or where people normally live. You need to know, where they live, exactly, in terms of, the building typology, for example. You need to know where they work and link that, to where they live as well. And you can imagine you have, some statistical information sometimes, like at a country level, but to do that and have like a distribution that would help you to identify hotspots at subnational level, becomes a challenge. We resolved, quite some of them, but certainly, it remains like a big challenge to really detail that at country level, for example, especially, when the country is small, so you need a very big detail. I would say that, however, the major challenge, we were, speaking about projections now, and so there is a dynamic factor, into the vulnerability and into the exposure that should be, taken into account. I would say that I can see, two issues there. First one is on how frequent do I have to update my exposure, for example, and my vulnerability assessment, okay? In some cases, sadly, the result is very fast. If you think about, for example, fragile countries, a country like Sudan, just to take an example, and you do an assessment like the one we did, okay? You do it at a certain point in time. In 1 year, everything has changed, but profoundly. If you do this, on the basis of that exposure, is really like a biased figure, the one you're going to get. Okay, now Khartoum is not the Khartoum that was there. 3 years ago. Okay, that's for sure. So, and the second one is how do we project that in future? Okay, we are talking about IPCC projections. Many times. Yeah, RCP. 2.6, RCP. 8.5. A lot of effort is going into hazard. Projection. But here, I would say exposure projection and vulnerability projection, they do count, even more in the few exercises that we've done, in some pilots to understand what is the contribution of exposure on one side and vulnerability and hazard. When they change in future, I can tell you that in many cases, exposure and vulnerability do count more than hazard. So we really need, I would say as modeler, to give a deep thought, into that and try, really, to come up with something robust, also for, predicting the trends of where people will be, in like a century or so, which is a lot of, like a new dimension of a challenge, I would say, because it's even more interdisciplinary. It's not just, let's say, hard physics modelers that can do that. We need, really to, join forces with a larger, I would say, panel of experts, to do that.
Thanks very much, Roberto. If I may, because I'd like this to be a little bit of a conversation, if I may. Before we get to you, Suzanne, could you, Robert and Roberto, could you both say something about how feasible is it to kind of merge two different types of model? I was talking to someone yesterday, I think at the Climate Mobility Pavilion, talking about a global model for population, population distribution over the next few years. So looking at how people are going to move, how are urban centers going to evolve, how are cities changing, etc. So how easy would it be to use the results of such a model for our exposure layer, to make the exposure layer a little bit more precise?
Robert, can I start and then? Okay. So I would say, if we are thinking about just using the results of that model, in our model, I can say it's easy. Let's call it like that. We can do that. The problem I see there is actually that that's not the truth, because when disasters are happening, they are actually shaping the mobility of people. No, so if something happens or does not happen, it actually gives you like a totally different, I would say, exposure pathway. Okay, so the real challenge there, and the really interesting thing as a researcher, I'm not saying that we are able to go there. Any let's say any soon or something. It would be to model the interaction between when a hazard, or when an event really strikes. What is it forcing? We are changing urban planning based on that. We are changing, the fact that people are moving and they are not coming back, and new, points of attractions are created. How and even the sequence is important. If we are having one event and then another one just after that, so also the accumulation of that could really change completely. I don't want to scare anyone, but it's really complex and it would be really nice. But as a first step, really to use those models a bit more and understand a bit more how we can, bidirectionally learn from each other. Would be interesting.
Maybe I'll just add that. So this bringing together models does work. If you think about integrated assessment models, which is the kind of centerpiece for the negotiations about mitigation, a little bit of adaptation as well. That's combining a lot of different models, maybe kind of similar. What sometimes is a bit difficult is to get you need one person or one institute who has a good understanding of all these models and if and how they can be combined, and there needs to be kind of faith in the methods and the data. And this is something that we've, I think, somewhat an issue that we've come across within the project is that if we're trying to kind of come up with this vulnerability approach, which is quite innovative, and what we want to do eventually is have everything totally integrated. But at this point, some of the combination of the vulnerability has been a post-processing part. So we run the model in Climada, and then afterwards we kind of apply a vulnerability lens to it. So in some ways it's nice to combine everything, but in some ways a more realistic approach, at least in the short term, is to adapt with a post-processing way of doing things too.
Great, thanks very much, both of you. So, we're talking about conceptual development, but we're also then talking about the need for data to feed those models, not just at the initial phase, but to be able to update that model as frequently as possible with changes and to make it an iterative process. So this is where we come to you, Suzanne, to talk about data. IOM, as you all know, is a key provider of primary displacement data, some of which is used to build these models. So could you tell us a little bit more about how IOM contributes and what are some of IOM's efforts to improve the evidence base that would be necessary to improve the accuracy of these models and to be able to update them as Roberto and Robert have mentioned. And in your mind, if you could also tell us why you and IOM feel that it's important to invest in risk modeling in the first place. Thanks.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thanks for those questions. No, I can't. I was trying not to look like Mickey Mouse. No, I was actually going to start with the fact that I never thought my parents were very creative with my name, and it's like a group name, but here I'm the only panelist that's not called Robert, so... No, and just to say, obviously data is very important, and we've seen already a scale in the displacement figures this year that I think even for us who've been working on data for a long time, it's really unbelievable. In West and Central Africa, about 2 million people due to floods in July and August. In Brazil, 800,000 people were displaced in the south in March this year. India, 2.3 million, Philippines, 1.7 million in July and August, and there was another cyclone recently. So these are all, Bangladesh, Mozambique, extents of displacement that are really hard to grasp, and I think are going beyond our imagination or worst nightmares. And what I wanted to bring in is the aspect of people, right? This is not just figures, there's always people behind. And we have these youth delegates here, and there's also a couple here in the audience. One of them is Simon Kimau from Tanzania, who shared his experience with us yesterday about, waking up, hearing neighbors trying to evacuate. No one was warned, no one knew what to do, no one was prepared. So we really need to do better. because we see these hazards. I mean, one thing is you read in the IPCC reports, but then seeing the figures, where it's here, it's very real. The humanitarian and loss and damage costs are going up incredibly, and this is what is being discussed here by governments. So we need to make sure that those are minimized and that we know what are some areas that are at risk, what are the people behind that are at risk, what are their profiles, and we need to invest in solutions, and that's also where, of course, Robert Piper's agenda comes in. And on IOM's side, we have a critical role there as well. For us, it's important, that governments are in the lead also with these solutions. It can't be just us academics or UN agencies. So we're also chairing an internal displacement solutions fund, for instance, and we co-lead the Global Data for Solutions internal displacement working group. To come to your first question, sorry, I reverted those. We're looking into IDP profiling, so with governments, other agencies, IDPs themselves. I think it's very important we bring in the people that are affected to move from humanitarian responses to more development-centered approaches, right? We know which areas are more likely to be affected, but we're not reaching the right people, and that's also what Simon was sharing. They didn't know, and we usually see already for decades that communities that have been affected by a disaster, then they are prepared, but that should be the other way around, right? And maybe a point about maybe countering a bit what Rob Oakes was saying about we've done some analysis of the data that IOM is collecting in the so-called the Displacement Tracking Matrix, DTM. We have that in more than 100 countries. And we analyzed a couple of countries with weather-related displacements, and there most IDPs actually want to remain where they are. It's often, it's not really feasible to go back, but there's a huge challenge on, how do you move forward on that. And maybe on the projections, since you were asking that, of course, they're only as good as the data, right? And that's something that we always have to explain also to governments that always want to know what happens in 5 years, what happens in 10 years. But if we don't have the data now, what are we going to build those projections on, right? So it's very important. We saw some inconsistencies, for instance, those of you who know the groundswell report by the World Bank for internal mobility in Africa, they were saying it will go up. And then there was another report on African climate mobility that said internal mobility in Africa will go down because they were based on different underlying data models. So there's still some, it's not perfect. So it's great to see that you've worked on these models. I think it's really important to move forward and know better which areas could be affected. So we're more prepared and also try to find solutions and other options before it's too late.
Thanks very much, Susan. And very important point that you make about, in some cases, the permanency of displacement, the inability to return to areas that are already now, but in the future likely to become more and more uninhabitable. And it will be interesting also to perhaps hear some more thoughts from our researchers here on whether it is even possible to model such a likelihood, and whether that kind of uninhabitability factor is something that can be included in these scenarios. But anyway, I would have lots of follow-up questions, but I don't want to deny the possibility to our audience to also ask questions. So let's take a round of questions and then see how we go from there.
Can you hear me? Yeah, hi. Steve Myron from the Refugee Law Initiative and also researching internal displacement. So as I hear the growing sophistication of the modeling, which is fantastic, focusing perhaps a bit more now on slow onset events and other vulnerability factors, for example, livelihoods, I can't but help think that as it shapes existing models for existing predictions, is going to raise the number of internally displaced people that we report today, just because a lot of people slip through the cracks of current modeling. Am I correct on that? And is there a sense of what that factor might be?
So let's respond to. Did you have a question? Okay. Was there another? There was another hand. Okay. So let's take 2 or 3 questions and then answer them.
Hi, good morning. Saint Luc Leblanc, IOM Youth Delegate. My question to Susan and Robert. With the studies being done and with all the evidence that you have gathered over the years, have you seen any policies come into existence that change the life of persons? If so, can you give any examples of such?
Great question, thank you. And Robert Pipe. Oh.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Right. Thank you very much for the panel. Lorenzo Guadagno from the platform Disaster Displacement. I have a question and a comment. The question would be, as you go into kind of localizing these models, to what extent do you think they will become usable for disaster planning and basically for planning responses and solutions to displacement? And then perhaps a comment/question maybe concerning something that Robert was saying about telling apart basically mobility as adaptation or loss and damage. As we're looking at displacement, we have this double value of life-saving versus flight and potentially damaging behavior, right? And I think that's where we have troubles with the definition of vulnerability. We have factors of vulnerability that are the typical factors that we look at for disaster risk assessment: poverty, exclusion, marginalization, belonging to minorities, that tend to be very linear. The more you have that, the more you're likely to be affected by a disaster. But we know that with displacement, that's not the case. You don't necessarily move, you're not more likely to move because you're poorer in many cases. Maybe you have less means to actually be displaced immediately. And that's reflected in what we observe from disaster behavior. The timing, the distance, they're not necessarily linked to these factors of vulnerability in a linear manner. And then how do you integrate that in a vulnerability function when you're modeling displacement risk?
Also a great question. Thanks, Lorenzo. And over to you, Robert.
Thank you. It is a great question. My question was a much simpler one, which is to Robert, which is, you mentioned Somalia, for example, but have you got some aggregated global numbers that we could hear for the world? I mean, a best case, a worst case, something like that. If you've got that number, that'd be great to hear. Thank you.
Brian,
Can I ask a quick question?
Quick one.
How much the risk is acknowledged among the companies, decision makers, and other stakeholders?
Great, thank you. Great, lots of questions. Let me try and group them a little bit. So Robert was and Steve, you were asking about sort of aggregate global estimates and whether the increase in slow onset events that are somewhat more difficult to quantify are likely to to lead to higher estimates in the future. Who would like to take that one? Maybe Robert?
It seems so, yeah. I think there's just so many methodological issues which make the quick onsets relatively easy to track, slow onset much more difficult. And I think it is improving in, IDMC, IOM, UNHCR. But yeah, I think we know that these numbers are a baseline number and numbers will be much higher. And I think, I don't know, in this session we're talking about numbers and we had this question, what is the overall global number? For me, I don't really want to give a number right now. The model is capable of generating these sort of numbers for drought, for example. So for slow onset numbers, it is possible. But then if we're looking at, we're trying to make it as context specific as possible. So we're thinking, if a drought hits Somalia, what's the conditions in Somalia? So, I wouldn't want to give a overall number, but so on that, I'm not going to do it. But generally, yes, we know that these numbers are underreported, and these sort of efforts presumably can work with the data collection agencies, and we will get a better figure which will help with programming, etc.
Thanks. Maybe I can just also answer that. What we're seeing at IDMC is that our estimates of displacements that we record every year, there isn't a linear trend upwards. It's very much, it sort of follows the seasonality and the temporality of hazards themselves. But what we are seeing is the duration of displacement, which we're not yet able to measure and to quantify accurately at the global level, but we have started now reporting on a global stock number of disaster displaced people. And I wouldn't say that one is also increasing because we don't have sort of enough historical data to show that, but I would imagine that as we get better at tracking people displaced over long periods of time, that stock number is also going to increase. Maybe Roberto, you could answer the tough question that Lorenzo asked. Yeah, I won't repeat it. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'd love to do that. But both, I would say the local, let's say, versus global, thing, and also this, trapped versus, the ownership. And I think that is very important. Well, let's start from the easy one. That easy one, to reply to. Not easy one to resolve. How much, these models can be, applied locally. Well, it depends, what you mean by locally. Okay? Because, of course, all of these is based, on, let's say, global models, that are actually, let's say, parameterized, I would say, to work, properly at a certain scale. So in many cases, you would have to change, I would say, a little bit the modeling framework. I would say not the modeling methodology, which could apply very well, even at a very localized scale. Actually, in many cases, it is actually designed, to do this, like, cost-benefit analysis on a very small scale. So that's good, that the overall, modeling framework would apply. But, the nature of the models, wouldn't need them to be, I would say, cautiously then, if you are telling me, if we want to break up, the numbers, for a large country, to smaller, admin levels, like for India, we want to go to admin 2, admin 3 for India. Yes, it could be done. If we want to go, in the fine detail of the small islands, which we did actually with the IDMC in another project, then you need a totally different approach, to the modeling component, but still in the same framework. While the other comment you have, is very interesting and it's a challenge. Now it's not represented in the model, but we have actually gone through some experiments and pilots in places through other, let's say, modeling framework like agent-based modeling and everything. To understand a bit better those non-linearities, because for example, you were saying, people could be, trapped because they don't have the means to move, and this is one non-linearity we have. But also the opposite thing, becomes true, because, people that do have the means, they have, they own land, they own places, and these attach them, to the territory. So they don't want to move for this reason. So it's very complex. People are complex. So, of course, it's really, and the challenge would be what it's possible to understand really on a very localized level with this type of modeling. Then there is a challenge on how you upscale it. For a probabilistic approach, for example, on a large scale. But we are trying, honestly trying, to do that.
Thanks very much, Roberto. Maybe over to you, Suzanne, to answer that. There were two questions. One from a gentleman there about whether there are any policies that you could mention that have been successful in addressing this issue, and also to link up to what you were saying about whether there is a sufficient acknowledgement of risk by policymakers, and to what extent then risk-relevant information is included in policy making and in policies. Are there any examples that you could mention there?
Thank you for your questions. To start with the question from the youth delegate, of course, it's a tough question. No, does any of our evidence, any of this information? I would say yes. Just to give you a couple of examples. About 10 years ago, I did a training in the Dominican Republic with government officials on the links between migration, environment, and climate change. And I remember someone from the Climate Change Council was there, and was telling me on the first day, I have no idea why I'm here. I don't work on migration. Why, you know. After the training, he was like, I can't believe I never looked at migrants in any of the things we do. Because when you, for instance, evacuate during a disaster, if you don't think about migrants speaking other languages, as simple as that, they won't understand what's happening. And if any one of you has lived in another part of your country or in another country and you don't speak the language, it's really difficult to understand what's going on if you don't have that access. So just taking that into consideration and kind of sensitize policymakers for different groups that may be affected to not leave anyone behind, as the Sustainable Development Goals say. Another example is the Argentine migration policy. They actually have one of the reasons you can enter the country is for humanitarian reasons linked to disasters. And that was, for instance, used by Haitians. And that was based on consultations where different actors, including IOM, but also many others, civil society academics, were presenting information. So that was a very concrete impact on an official policy. Also, Brazil has humanitarian visas, for instance, for the earthquake in 2010. To the last question, on the acknowledgement of risk by policymakers. There's probably awareness that we need to plan ahead, but often there's not much, we don't take the time to actually look at, for instance, foresight, look at what could potentially happen, because, if it has not happened yet, it's hard to imagine, right? There's a lot of things a couple of years ago were unthinkable and now they're reality. And I think what needs to happen a lot more is integrating foresight mechanisms into policies. So not just react on what has happened in the last years, but actually anticipate what will be happening in the future. And I think there's a lot of room for maneuver and a lot more that needs to be done. And also, to be very honest, internally we're also trying to do that a lot more, to think ahead and not just react when something happened.
Thank you very much to all of you. I've just looked at the time and we only have 10 minutes left. I'd like to hand over to Robert Piper for some final remarks. But in the meantime, let me thank you all for joining us, for answering these questions, for presenting our work. I hope you found this informative. But over to you, Robert. Robert is great at summing things up and talking about next steps. Over to you.
Thanks, Alexandra, and thank you all. Do you hear me okay? I'm going to keep my earphones on because it's a lot of background noise. What a fantastic discussion. Thank you so much, all of you, for what is a really critical piece of this puzzle. This conversation around modeling, as you know, we've been working on solutions, on trying to bring down tomorrow's numbers, trying to move more IDPs out of their situations of protracted displacement. And the issues often revolve around, particularly around looking long-term at risk reduction measures, looking at adaptation strategies around climate, looking at preparedness measures and so forth. And without these hard numbers, without this modeling, it's very difficult to kind of move this equation forward. So I find this contribution absolutely vital to what we're trying to do. The hard end of what we've heard about on these numbers, I take away some key kind of messages and lessons that we need to follow through on and feed this analysis into. The first, I think, is the slow onset disasters. And as the number of people said, these numbers are still difficult. The methodologies are still kind of quite early in their development. But slow onset disasters are fundamentally shifting our displacement picture. And as we heard from Suzanne, people displaced by weather, particularly things like drought, are more and more likely, for example, to choose to integrate locally because their livelihood is no longer viable where they came from. We see that in Somalia, for example, this sort of break in the pattern of people wanting still to go home relatively quickly after their displacement, almost everywhere, except now in places like Somalia, where weather and climate is starting to fundamentally shift their options and their perspectives, if you will. So the first piece is on that slow onset component, where the data and the modeling is so vital, and we need to understand the distinction, if you will, between these sudden onset and the slow. The second is that we have been working the last few years on developing solutions pathways with governments in the pilot countries where we've worked. And solutions are very expensive. Now, it's pretty obvious that when you're trying to rebuild someone's life from their home to their livelihood, to their community, to their assets, it's a very expensive proposition. If you need a business case for prevention, not a humanitarian one, but if you need a business one, then boy, is the data very clear. 2 weeks ago, the Somalia government launched their solutions pathway for 1 million Somali displaced people. It's a $2 billion price tag. 2 days ago in Addis Ababa, the government of Ethiopia launched a process for about 2 million IDPs, and it will come in also at about $2 billion. We project Iraq's budget requirements to find solutions for about 1.1 million remaining IDPs in Iraq will be closer to $7 billion. Solutions are expensive. The business case for prevention, for modeling, for looking at risk and acting much, much earlier is got to be more and more compelling, and this is absolutely kind of crucial for that purpose. Thirdly, I hope this analysis feeds into governments taking more early action. We have looked at, the OECD looked at lots of national adaptation plans, the NDCs, and we see time and time again governments with high risk of displacement due to climate who are not factoring this into their plans and strategies. Less than 3 out of 10 high-risk governments have brought this displacement factor into their adaptation plans. Less than 3 out of 10. So we need also these models to drill into these governments why it's so important that they factor this issue into their adaptation strategies and their contribution plans, if you will, around the climate disaster risk reduction agenda. We need numbers, we need projections in order to influence plans, and only then can we get financing. So for me, it's all sort of the end game is to raise the financing necessary to turn a lot of good analysis and projections and ideas into action. It all kind of revolves around this. That's the hard stuff, the numbers and how they can shape government behaviors and how they can influence plans, how they can influence strategies around preparedness, early warning, and so forth. But there's a soft piece to this, a political piece, which I want to finish on, which has really struck me listening to this, which is this question of voluntariness. And I keep getting hit by it as I look at the climate dimension of internal displacement. And I recognize that our whole architecture in terms of mobility is structured around basically this notion of voluntariness, this idea that either people choose to move because they're pursuing an opportunity and they need to be enabled and they need to do that safely, but it's essentially driven by a sort of choice, or they are forcibly displaced and they don't have the choice and they're responding to factors outside of their control. And their agency, of course, always have agency to some degree, but much less agency. And our whole architecture internationally around people on the move is basically organized around that axis. And I think what we're hearing today and more from this modeling, and as we look at vulnerability and so forth more effectively, is that axis is coming apart as a clear defining distinction in terms of understanding what is going on out there. This notion that people, when you've had 5 years of drought, when your livelihood is no longer viable in your place of origin, moving to towns, is that a voluntary act of migration? Is that a displacement due to forces outside your control? It's really becoming very, very blurry. So I really, there's a lot at stake here, actually, in terms of developing these models and trying to flesh out, these issues around vulnerability and risk, because indeed they are helping us very importantly understand what forces people to move, why people make certain choices, and at the end of the day also to what extent they have agency over those choices or not. Now, it's going to get harder and harder to address that, but it's a fundamental piece of understanding a very changing background to this issue of displacement. So thank you all. Alexandra, thank you for setting this up, this conversation. Thank you IOM also for the sponsorship, and thanks for the opportunity to participate. I learned a lot. Thank you so much.
Not much more to add. Thank you very much for participating. Thanks, Robert, for your final words, and thank you to our speakers and IOM for the pavilion. So, thank you. Have a good rest of the day.